How's it hanging, everybody? Welcome back to Tag Team, Pokemon Trading Card Game's premier podcasting duo. My name is Riley Hulbert, joined as always by my good friend, Mr. JW Kriewall. Andrew is out today. GW, how's it going?
Hey, doing pretty good, Riley. Yeah, it was a big week for us. Had some time to spend in New York City with Ant's family, so that was really nice. Always good to get into the city. We went over to Flushing, and we saw some traditional Chinese dancing because, as you know, it's the Lunar New Year.
Yes,
as I'm sure you're well aware.
Well, I was actually, because in New Zealand there was infinite Chinese tourists who were there because they had long leaves for Lunar New Year, and there were celebrations and stuff. It was crazy, actually.
Yeah, well, I didn't really know this until this year, but it's not just a day, right? Like in America,
no, it's a month. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's about a 2-week or a 16-day period, which obviously lends itself to, extended breaks, tourism, that kind of thing. So anyway, we were in New York, and as you can imagine, that's when you have these large metropolises, you get these pockets of people who are trying to preserve that culture. And so we had a chance to see some dancing, see some lion dancing, seen some traditional women dancing, and we had some good Chinese food, so it was pretty sick.
That sounds awesome. Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, man. What'd you get up to this weekend?
Not a lot. I was feeling kind of crappy as I rounded out the week. I think going to a full work week after the amount of traveling that we did and not necessarily having a ton of time to readjust was pretty challenging physically.
Well, physically, but not only physically, but mentally, I have to imagine as well.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're like, man, I was in paradise, and now I have to look at my my Giro board,
yeah,
my Slack channels.
We don't use Slack, but or Jira actually. But
wait, what do you use? What do you guys?
We have our own systems, and we use Teams primarily for chatting.
Oh, Teams. Okay, gotcha.
And Teams is cool, but you can't make custom emotes, which I believe is a Slack feature. So
right.
I think lose some.
I think they're addressing that at their upcoming.
That's what I heard.
Reveal.
Yeah, as you can. Yeah. But this is so beside the point. So I woke up on Saturday, and I felt awful. I felt physically terrible. And I slept in a lot on Saturday too. So I was really worried actually that I was getting sick again. And for avid listeners, they might remember I spent most of December and much of November sick, so I was really upset at the idea of getting sick again. Thankfully, with some rest and relaxation, I woke up fine on Sunday, and I feel even better today than I did on Sunday. And I took some of the honey, the special medical honey that we got in New Zealand. I took that. I took a spoonful of that when I started feeling sick, and maybe that was the difference maker. Who knows?
Maybe. Yeah, that's great, man. That's great.
So yeah, I felt kind of crappy. I did also try and make my first ever loaf of focaccia bread. First time at bread making. I've baked a lot of sweets type things, but never bread before. And it turned out fine. It was a little underproofed, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a little dense, a little floury in taste, but it was. We were having it with soup, and honestly, it went fine with soup.
Sure. Sure.
So, but I probably wouldn't have ate much more of it, on its lonesome. So I'm gonna try again this weekend, and I'll let you know next week how that goes.
No, seriously, keep me updated. I love a good bread. And I think that you can actually bread, you can cover a lot of sins with bread. I think bread can go pretty wrong and still be good, or still be edible, still be fine, especially if you pair it with the soup, man. The bread doesn't have to be the star of the show.
Well, that was the thing, because we had the nice salty herbal crust, and that went really well with soup,
Yeah,
and
so
even though the bread itself wasn't phenomenal, it ended up being like a fine pairing with the soup. So I was
Man.
overall, I like was happy I tried it. I will definitely want to improve on it for my next time, but um, I wanted to try a new thing and I did. And so like, hey, you can't be too mad about that.
Nice.
And I was happy as well to see the Eagles completely crush the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. I'm normally not like an avid football fan, but I was born in Philadelphia and my grandparents lived there. My partner's family lives in the Philadelphia area, so lots of Eagles like heritage.
Yeah.
So that was fun as well.
Well, I did not know this before moving to Jersey, but basically like the north half of New Jersey is all the New York teams, and you know, I only say that because it's kind of, you know, tongue in cheek, because the New York Giants and the New York Jets both play in the Meadowlands, which is in New Jersey. But then you also have, like, you know, so that's the north half of Jersey, and then the south half of Jersey, I guess, has allegiances to like Philadelphia sports. So I have a number of friends, you know, through church that are all Philadelphia Eagles fans, and so they had a great time. I'm sure. Gonna catch up with them tomorrow, and I had no idea.
Yeah, who knew? Who knew?
So anyway, fraudulent Super Bowl. Fraudulent should have been the Lions, but we'll get them next year.
That's so true, man. That's so true. That's the attitude, I think.
That's right. Well, if they didn't injure like most of their defense, then they would have been there for sure.
Well, the thing is, the script actually called for the Chiefs to win the 3-peat and then for Travis Kelce to propose to Taylor that night on TV. But they went really off script. And so what does that mean for Travis and Taylor? Who could say, honestly? Who can say? This is pretty bad, though. If I'm not gonna lie, if I was Taylor right now, I'd really be considering my next breakup song.
Yeah. Anyway, I think that's what the listeners are here for. But we'll have to cut that short. You'll have to stay for the extended episode to hear more about that. But we had a regional this last weekend in Mexico, Merida, Mexico. And so we're going to take some time to dissect the results. Thankfully, I mean, this is a very cool thing that just started happening recently, but we have all of the deck lists from the regional available to us today. So walk through kind of what we were seeing, some of the trends of the first regional in the Prismatic Evolutions format, and then there is a tournament coming up this weekend, so kind of projecting what happened in Merida onto what is potentially going to happen at the special event in Puerto Rico this weekend, and then of course into EUIC in 2 weeks. So why don't you kick us off, Riley? Tell us what happened. What were some of the big storylines from the Merida Regional Championships?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, is it Merida or is it Merida?
Merida.
Well, no, because there's an accent over the E, so the emphasis is actually.
Oh, well, okay, I tried. Wait, how would you say it? Merida.
It might actually be Merida in the end.
Merida.
It's been a lot of years. It would not be Merida. It would not be Merida. Regardless, before we make fools of ourselves any more than we already have, the regional was not like traditionally streamed. You know, there wasn't any Play Pokemon sponsored stream there. So inherently that like reduces the accessibility of information about the state of the event, which is one of the unfortunate
event, right?
Yeah, during the event, which is one of the unfortunate parts of the regionals that Pokemon doesn't take part in. That said, there were some prevailing storylines. I think one of the most interesting ones to me was seeing the picture of Azul playing a lightning deck that came out during day one. I think you were way up in the replies of that tweet.
Yeah. Yep. Let me see if I can't find that, because I mean that was fantastic. I was kind of shocked because even with that group, which is kind of a core I would say, over the last decade or so of Azul, Grant, Manley, and Caleb Gademer, I mean, generally I would say has stayed away from these style of decks, which is just kind of the beat stick, big basic deck.
Well, they did have
of
the
course,
Raging Bolt.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say, of course, Caleb won a regional earlier this year with Raging Bolt, but generally that's not kind of the flavor of decks that they favor. But yeah, it was fascinating seeing Azul walk up with Miraidon. I think that's a generally hated on deck, pretty much for the entirety of its existence, for better or for worse. I mean, I think our group has fully respected Miraidon, and it's been, in our opinion, a pretty top tier deck for the majority of its existence. But again, not something that you necessarily think. It just has this aura about it that certain players, I don't think, can fully understand. Right? They cannot fully embody the aura of Miraidon.
So true. Yeah, Miraidon's a big aura deck. Absolutely is. So anyway, like that was one of the things that stuck out to me from the very first day of play. Some other noteworthy things just from the state of the state on the tournament. There were 1,151 players in attendance, which I think is pretty good for like an outside the U.S. regional, outside the U.S. non-European regional. So that was really cool as well. Super well attended by United States, Canada players. So that's always cool to see that cross-pollination of the regions. And ultimately, as it all shook out and top 8 was on the table, notably there was a top 14, I think it was, with the asymmetric cut, a super wide asymmetric cut. And when all the cards were down and everything fell, Miraidon was really the champion of the tournament, both literally with Azul actually taking the win with Miraidon after that fateful picture, but sort of generalistically too. There were 3 Miraidons in the top 8 and one more with Caleb in the top 14, that asymmetrical cut, which not only does that show just Miraidon's general dominance, it also shows like most of the Miraidons were able to squeak through like that first round of asym as well. Get to that top 8.
What's crazy is that it was actually 4 in top 8. So it was half of top 8, right?
Oh my gosh, yeah. I like completely glazed over one. Yeah, so there's 5 in the top 14 and 4 in top 8. Half of the top 8. That's ridiculous. I mean, that is actually ridiculous.
Yeah, kind of absurd. So I guess the question becomes and we'll take a look at some lists here in just a second, but why was Miraidon a deck that players gravitated toward for this first tournament in the new format? Because I think we've also seen, Miraidon perform very well, almost specifically like this version of Miraidon with the Area Zero and the Pikachu EX and, double Iron Hands and trying to go that strategy. We saw that perform very well in Sacramento, if you'll remember, just a few short months ago, in the start of the Surging Sparks format, and then it kind of just trailed off, and Miraidon wasn't really seen as, a major threat from there on out. So why do you think players for this tournament, for this new format, decided to play Miraidon? What were some of the factors that, and then also kind of in the tournament, why do you think Miraidon succeeded to the degree that it did?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're in the shoes of someone like Azul or Caleb, or any of these folks who ended up succeeding with Miraidon over in Mexico, the first thing that comes to mind in these brand new formats is having that sort of aggression and playing your cards on the table and seeing what your opponent can do about it. That's a relatively tried and true strategy over the course of Pokemon's history at the start of new formats. Very consistently, like just having a really consistent, like ram your face in the opponent style of deck. It punishes people who are trying out new things maybe for the first time, who are experimenting with different archetypes, or are trying to get like creative with their strategy. And Miraidon is really good at like throwing its stuff at the opponent's face and seeing what sticks in those early phases of a format, sort of agnostic of the specific state of this format. When we talk about the Prismatic Evolutions, set specifically, this is something that we have talked about on the cast over the last couple of weeks, but the Badu effect on the metagame, I think, is prominent here. And in that Miraidon's a super item heavy deck, but it can go through so many of those on the first turn of the game, whether that's turn one going first or turn one going second. You'll have the opportunity to play all those items out, set up a board state with multiple lightning energy, potentially multiple attackers. You have the Magneton to also accelerate additional energy without necessarily needing another item. And now Badu's not like a big threat. If you have an Iron Hands on board, you're not going to like Badu into that thing. That's ridiculous. So instead, you're just laying on the aggression. You're forcing your opponent to respond to you, which can be tough. You look at Gardevoir and Dragapult being the other like primary contenders, and Dragapult can do okay into Miraidon, but all it takes is one turn, and Miraidon just completely steals the game from there. It takes one turn of an Iron Hand surviving a hit, and the game's basically over. And I think that's ultimately why Miraidon is thriving right now. It's capitalizing on the fact that its ops, namely Charizard, are down with Badu, and Miraidon's relatively resilient into Badu.
Yeah, totally. I think that's an interesting point because you look at Charizard as being the Miraidon killer, just historically over the last year or so, and Badu being a factor to some degree in a number of decks. You saw it in some of these Guardy lists. Certainly saw it in the Dragapult decks. I have to imagine kept Charizard somewhat in check, right? I don't know that necessarily a lot of players pick Charizard. I mean, if we look down the standings here, our first Charizard with a finish comes in at around the top 70. Like there's our first one that I see. 79th. So just kind of a historically poor performance, I would argue, from Charizard. But again, I think that certainly is due to the fact that you have these cards like Badu and to maybe a lesser extent but still prominent extent the Regigigas kind of keeping these Charizard decks at bay. So that's a really good point that you bring up there.
I also think noteworthily, like the Dragapult has historically been a deck that can really capitalize on Charizard super well.
Yeah.
Badu notwithstanding, and so Badu causing such a surge in like dedicated Dragapult archetypes is also like not exactly what Charizard wants to see at the table either.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think the thing for me with Miraidon, said many times, but bears repeating, is that you're playing every game. And if we look at some of the top players' lists, and we'll just click into Azul's here, this is just geared toward getting into the game. I think about Rotom V as an obvious inclusion. That's a card that, when you choose to go first, you're going to get that out and you get an additional draw, and that can, bail you out of some of these awkward hands that sometimes, very rarely, Miraidon has, but just another good tool for the deck. Of course, you have that Pheasantipity, Squawkabilly, Mew, Luminion combo, right, of support Pokemon. You're just going to have something to do in every single game, and that I think is pay dividends for all the Miraidon players. A pretty standard list here. If I look at Azul's, nothing interesting really. I mean, you could maybe argue that the Switch Cart was something interesting, that can get you out of a Mawile lock, that can get you out of Snorlax one time, but other than that, just a generally straightforward, I hate to say cookie cutter list, but there's really nothing unusual or innovative about this list, but it was good enough certainly to take the crown. Now, one thing that I do want to point out about this list is that there's no Zapdos. There's no Zapdos. And why is that interesting? Well, I think that that's fascinating because there's no Mimikyu counter by and large for this deck. You could argue that Magneton could two-shot a Mimikyu, but that's, Mimikyu can two-shot the Magneton. So that's not really like the best strategy generally when you're attacking with that. And then you also lose out on some of the math in certain matchups. I think about Raichu into a Gardevoir EX hitting for 310 with that additional +1 +10 damage from the Zapdos, so you only have to discard 5 energy instead of 6. I think about Pokemon that have 130 HP, notably the Duraludon, right, in the Archaludon deck that has 130 HP. So you can knock out a Duraludon with the Iron Hands, right, for 130. I also think about Monkey Dory. If you have to attach a double turbo, then you can get the Zapdos down and you can knock out a Monkey Dory with Iron Hands. So there's a number of situations. I would argue they're fairly niche, and you could get away with, just attacking with something else and maybe taking a 2 prize and just kind of or taking a 1 prize there and just overwhelming with the constant pressure. But it is interesting. You also think about opposing Iron Hands not being able to hit for 230, or something like a Roaring Moon, or maybe even in the finals, right, like a 230 Entei or a 230 Gouging Fire. So that didn't end up mattering, obviously, but it is something that I find somewhat interesting, and we'll talk a little bit about counters, and where we see the meta trending. But Mimikyu is certainly a hard counter, and I wouldn't be surprised to see that in more lists moving forward of things like Guardy, but no Zapdos. I would say that's the big kind of takeaway for me, is that slot was dedicated, I guess notably, to dedicated more consistency.
14 lists. Mm-hmm. From right on, only Caleb Rogerson played the Zapdos.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because that's a card that I was kind of high on, but maybe the people that were going just said, okay, if I play a Snorlax deck, like, I will probably lose that anyway, or if I play a Gardevoir deck that plays a Mimikyu, like, I guess you could gust around that, so or bundle around that, so maybe that's not the biggest issue. Yeah, I don't know what the thought process is, because I kind of see that Zapdos as a...
I think Mimikyu is not that good in Guardy, because of what you're saying. It's really hard to set up a Mimikyu board state that just doesn't end up being fragile in its own right.
Yeah.
And also, like, let's say you do set up like a really resilient Mimikyu board, like you have one Mimikyu, one Kirlia or something. If your opponent you're going to bet your opponent doesn't play Zapdos or something, and then all of a sudden they do, and you just instantly lose the game. Like, that's not fun either. So they're kind of forced to, like, probably bench wider and just go for KOs. And at that point, why are you playing Mimikyu? And I think you're probably right that, so, like, you're looking at Snorlax stalls maybe in the other Mimikyu deck, and that's probably tough anyway. I do agree, though, with the two, like, relatively niche but still relevant points of math. Like, I'm thinking mainly Iron Hands into, exactly like you said, like Duraludon into Monkey Dory. I'm trying to think, the 230 threshold, technically it did end up being relevant for Azul in the finals, though. I don't think Gouging Fires are primarily what people are checking their deck out for.
Yeah.
And I guess Terapagos has 230. So that's a piece of math right there. But you can also probably knock out a Terapagos with your Raikou.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing there is exactly right. And we kind of saw Azul take this game plan. All these decks that have 230 HP Pokemon are going to have a bench, right? They need to either have backup attackers or they need to have support Pokemon. They're going to have a bench that you can either gust up, right? If they have a something like a Squawkabilly on the bench, gust that up until you can adequately deal with the 230 HP Pokemon, or you swing at it twice and hope that you don't get knocked out in return. You can maybe take an additional prize on an Iron Hands, and then you close out the game with the Raichu V. Just do a big blow up, and if you go back and watch that stream of the finals, you'll see that that's pretty much what happened. So, I think it's kind of hard to argue. We look back at the top 16 and all the Miraidon that did well, just playing what I would consider just these hyper focused, practically zero tech builds of Miraidon, and that just was what ended up doing well. possibly due to just having, again, more consistency probably than most any other deck in the format, or also due to just not a lot of counters, things like the stall decks, things like Charizard, both seem like the meta trends for this new format that we're in. But yeah, Miraidon, fantastic deck. Azul winning his 8th regional, and I think that puts him at most all time, breaking out of a tie with Michael Pramawat, who now is second place, held the top spot there for quite a while. But Azul just coming in and doing it. First tournament, first regional this year, I think, and winning is quite a statement.
That is quite a statement. Is it his first? Did he not go to SAC? I'm legit. I'm not like implying.
Okay, well, all right. Somebody can leave us a comment.
I think he did go to SAC.
That would make sense, right? He's out in California. That would probably. Okay, second regional. Got it.
Yeah.
In any case,
still quite impressive, of course. He put his money where his mouth is, right? Like he said, he wasn't going to chase the point grind, and then he was going to win a regional instead, or like top an IC, and he did do that. So, respect for that. For sure.
So now he can make content for the rest of the tournaments. So,
you got to imagine you'll see him at the ICs.
Well, that one is just it's too weighted in favor of the players compared to regionals. Regionals are horrific for again, not to say like that this should be a primary factor, but in terms of the return on investment for any player going to a regional versus an IC, it's heavily weighted both in terms of the monetary payouts and the point payouts. So just got to do it. Anyway, you're right. So Azul playing against in the finals Mauricio Patino, another American. I thought it was quite fun that it was an all-American finals in Mexico on the day of the Super Bowl and Gulf of America Day, which just fascinating stuff. Really don't want to think too much more about that, but an interesting list from Mauricio here with his Gouging Fire deck. Now this was a deck that I gather, I'm not very familiar with this player, but I gather has been playing quite a lot of Gouging Fire, and it certainly seems like that kind of deck, because I know there's there was a UK player, Luke Kirkham, who had played this deck pretty significantly in formats past. It definitely seems like the kind of deck that would reward a player for bringing it tournament after tournament. Like, it seems like a deck where it's good. It's maybe not as traditionally good as some of these other decks, but if all the stars align, if everything goes right, if like the format is right and the metagame is right, you can have a deep run. Exactly what happened here, and comes within one game of winning the Merida Regionals.
Yeah, and Gouging Fire is certainly not a deck that people are like talking about or considering.
No.
In any like large capacity. It's got its couple shooters, and that's really about it. Pretty sure we've talked smack on Gouging Fire at some point in our storied history here on Tag Team. So really cool to see the dedication pay off. I can't imagine we will see this translate into like long-term Gouging Fire stonks type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
To me, Gouging Fire feels in a lot of ways similar to Miraidon. In some ways, in a lot of key ways different, but it's similar in that it's like a really aggro basic deck, and going to be resilient to Badu for a lot of the same reasons. You also do have Monkey Dory, which is a way you can steal prizes against decks that play Badu, which is nice. Ultimately, I think the metagame was set up really well for some of these really aggressive basic decks to succeed. And Azul also did win off of like a donk, basically. So
yeah,
Gouging Fire, I would have to imagine, has a decent matchup into Rhydon going second at least.
Yeah, I mean that was the situation, right? It was tied up 1-1 heading into that final game. I mean, inherently with a deck like Gouging Fire, you're going to be slightly more inconsistent, just given that your Pokemon can't search out other Pokemon.
Yeah.
And so, or I should say, one of your main
Crazy,
attackers
right?
can't search out other Pokemon. So, yeah, you're naturally more prone to those types of situations. But really an interesting list, interesting deck. I just feel like, again, this is the type of deck that not many players have played in the past. Not many players will probably pick up, but the players that know it inside and out are probably very happy with their choices generally when they go to these major tournaments. And I don't ever remember Gouging Fire being this close to winning a regional, but congratulations to Mauricio for almost making it happen. That was really cool. I think the other
The
big
Gougers out there.
the Gougers, yeah. Shout out if you're a Gouger. By the way, we are recording this on YouTube, so if you are on YouTube watching this, or if you're a Spotify only listener or Apple Music listener and you want to see some visuals surrounding this podcast, you can head on over to YouTube at the Tag Team Podcast YouTube channel. We have that all up. So, I don't know, leave a comment or something. Say that, you came from Spotify or Apple or Google or wherever you're at and are watching
Should have
it
gouged that
over
subscribe
on YouTube.
button.
Yeah, absolutely gouge that subscribe button. This will be the new standard for us moving forward. But the other storyline I was going to say from the top tables at Merida, of course, was the conversion of Dragapult. Dragapult was seemingly the big deck, I would say, heading into Prismatic Evolutions. I think, certainly I respected the deck as, a serious contender. I think it showed a lot of promise in the online space. And I would say it had a good showing. And dare I say, even a great showing. You have 5 in the top 16. A lot of those players ended up losing in that ASIM cut. But Aiden Koos was able to take the highest placing Dragapult Dusknoir deck to a 5th place finish. So I think overall, a very successful weekend generally from Dragapult. What are some thoughts here, Riley, moving forward? Do you feel like Dragapult lived up to the hype? Were you a little bit disappointed that it couldn't go further? Where do you feel like Dragapult, kind of stands right now, and some reflections?
I think Dragapult is obviously like a higher end contender in this metagame. What disappoints me, I think, with Dragapult Dusknoir is seeing 4 of them in that 9 to 14 range, which signals they all lost their ASIB games, which you never love to see. Now, when you just look at top 14 in totality, Dragapult showed up just as hard as Miraidon did if you just consider raw number of decks and their showings. It always does give me a little bit pause, though, when you see the decks fall off so hard, so early in top cuts. Especially at this level of consistency where they all kind of lost. This is one tournament. One tournament doesn't define a deck, and I think ultimately getting that many decks into the top 14 is noteworthy in of itself, and we'll continue to see Dragapult as one of the top end contenders. It maybe feels like it got a little bullied out though at the end of the tournament by some of these more aggressive decks.
Yeah, you always wonder if that's just it just happened to be that way, right? It happened to be, maybe a series of unfortunate hands, a series of, who knows, misplays, right?
Arguably though, Dragapult Dusknoir, it has those hands. That's the downside of playing that Dusknoir line is you're sacrificing some of that latent consistency for the explosive power. You're not playing a Pidgeot, you're not playing B-Barrel or anything like that. And there's cost to that, and that cost is sometimes you draw little dingers of hands.
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking at Aiden Koos's list here. Anything that stands out to you? I mean, for me, there's maybe a few things like I've really enjoy that Aiden opted for a very heavy ball count, having the 4 Buddy Buddy Poffins, the 4 Ultra Balls, and the 2 Nest Balls. That's something that, I mean, even me personally, trying out the Dragapult deck in the early pre-tournament stages of this format, I was like, okay, I could maybe cut down to like 2 Ultra Ball to try to fit in some of these other cards that I really want, and how many Nest Ball do I really need? But certainly looking at the list, I think this is very clean, has a lot going on with it. The 4 Arven just make the most sense. You are always going to want to be searching out that Sparkling Crystal on the turn that you need it. 4 Sealstone obviously is going to be a great card for you as well. So very interesting that...
I think the...
Yeah,
sorry.
No, go for it.
I think the heavy search makes a ton of sense, right? Like
Yeah.
you're not as dedicated to like searching out, again, like kind of harping back to the like you're not playing a Pidgeot point. You don't have like as much raw search and raw onboard kind of potential there, and so you need to be. There's a couple things. Like first, in those early turns, you want to have lots of basics down. You want to be able to evolve into like your Dusknars and your Dusclops and your Dracloaks as frequently as and as soon as possible. So being able to draw lots of raw items to start the game is good. But then also you're relying on Dracloak to like supplement your Arven. Arven is in isolation, like without other cards in your hand, is not that strong of a supporter, right? Like you need more things to go with it typically. So you're relying on Dracloak to supplement that, which means you also need to be drawing into more like outs and ways to like extend your combos. And the way that you do that is by playing lots of outs. You play the 4 Ultra Balls, so that way you can draw into them with your Dracloak, get your Dragapult off that, and Arven for the rare candy instead of having Arven for the Ultra Ball. It makes a lot of sense to me to maximize your outs for both of those things, both your turn 1 and your Dracloak hitting your future mons.
Yeah, do you think that how I've been playing the list has been with TM Evo, and so this build from Aiden, again, the highest placing Dragapult player, you just take things from that. I mean, we could look at all the Dragapult lists in totality, but just looking at the highest placed list without TM Evo, does that give you pause at all? I mean, that's how I've been really trying to play the deck. I find that there's some issues oftentimes when I can't get multiple Dracloak out, similar to like the Guardy deck, right? Where if you're not able to get multiple Kirlia, you can't draw into what you need, you're not seeing the resources that you need, and you ultimately falter. So do you have any thoughts there on whether or not players should include or remove TM Evolution from their deck in Dragapult?
I haven't played enough to have like super strong independent opinions. I was taking a look. There are 3 of the 5 did not play TM Evo, and 2 of the 5 did. So if you find that at all meaningful, run with that. I will say what makes me nervous about TM Evo in general is you're playing like 6 energy, and the TM Evo is only useless if like you set up your board with basics. So like the counterpoint to the 6 energy is like, oh, you just Arven for the Earthen Vessel and the TM Evo. But that means you also need to have like a Buddy Buddy Poffin in hand, or alternatively, you need to have an energy in hand. And I just think like you'll hit that a lot of games, but is that better? The question you have to answer is hitting that 6. I don't know. What would you say your ratio is of hitting the TM Evo when you want it?
Maybe like 50 to 60% of games that I want it.
Yeah,
right? That it makes sense.
That's kind of what I was going to ballpark estimate. It was like 50 to 60%. So that kind of lines with my kind of gut feel.
Yeah.
So it's like hitting that in like 50% of the games you want it, better than having more Ultra Balls to like more consistently execute your game plan in 100% of games.
Right.
And so the ceiling is probably higher on TM Evo, but it's just implicitly a little less reliable of a strategy.
Yeah.
So, when you're playing a less reliable deck, like Dragapult Dusknar, kind of on the face of it, I think Aiden Kusa's response was, I'm going to maximize within this like unreliable archetype. I'm going to maximize the reliability. And he did place the highest of his peers.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about Ultra Ball and why I had only had, I was testing a 3, I cut it down to 2. I really only found Ultra Ball valuable for searching out the Dragapults. And so I found that the resource discard was actually a big deal, right? Because you're not drawing as much as a Gardevoir deck. You really don't want a lot of these resources in the discard pile. It's not like you're very easily able to recover a Pokemon or an energy, right? Of course, you do have Night Stretcher. You may opt to play a Super Odd, but that's not. I wouldn't say, great to like put something in the discard pile to get it back later with Night Stretcher. That is a strategy, but that's not like something you're actively looking to do in every single game, just because you want to mitigate how many resources are being wasted. But yeah, I think that's the kind of interesting thing for me is that, I'd always found like, okay, having that option to Evo was good and not trying to force it with Ultra Balls. Of course, it does play a couple of Lance, so that can offset things. And, I wonder if players will take this to like a logical extreme of playing the 4 Arvin and then 4 Lance, with the idea being you Arvin turn 1 and get all set up, and then you Lance on turn 2 and get all your Dracoloak out. I wonder if that's a strategy. But anyway, great finish from Aiden and a lot of these other Dragapult players. I think this cements Dragapult as being one of the top 3, as we had talked about in weeks past, like coming into this Prismatic Evolutions format. We were thinking, yeah, Dragapult's going to be right up there. Probably has the most to gain from a card like Badoo. I think this tournament solidified that.
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
So beyond that, we talk about like a big 3. I mean, we've talked about Miraidon dominating. That has to be in the conversation. We talk about Dragapult as being, a menace, right? It was all over those top tables. Third deck for me is Gardevoir. Gardevoir is that third deck, and I really see Gardevoir as actually a pretty big winner from this tournament kind of moving forward. What were your thoughts on Gardevoir for Merida, and then kind of seeing these results? Do you think that Gardevoir is any better or worse than you thought? Where do you place it at this point?
I was hot on Gardevoir. I'm not going to lie. I was really into Gardevoir kicking off this format. I think it had a lot of really solid matchups. It's also just kind of like that deck, it could beat everything to some extent if you get the right combos off and are allowed to get off your game plan. It's pretty brutal, honestly. It's like, I don't know about you, but I always feel like terrified when I'm playing against Gardevoirs because I always feel like I'm on the verge of losing.
Yeah, totally. And it's so tough too. Well, just with time. I always worry about playing against Gardevoirs because I'm like, oh crap, if we, I have a shot here as long as I draw, optimally heading into the last few turns, and
I know,
I don't, and then I lose a 30-minute game 1, and it's like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, you really have to lay the pressure on them and draw off the Ionos and potentially the stamps and all that stuff. It's crazy. So Gardevoir was a deck I was really high on personally. I think it had a lot of really good answers to stuff in the format. And I don't think that was totally unfounded. You do see a couple Gardevoirs sprinkled in the top 16, top 32. Only one ended up actually squeaking into the asymmetrical cut, made 7th place. So losing relatively early in the elimination as well. I think the main op for Gardevoir, ironically, both of them are in this top 8, and like Dragapult's a harder matchup. It's not impossible, but it's harder. And Miraidon is a tough matchup for Gardevoir. Like going in with an early Iron Hands, Gardevoir typically doesn't have the response to that exceptionally quickly. Usually the best Gardevoir response to an Iron Hands will have been to already got the TM Evo off and then to swing with a Gardevoir EX into the Iron Hands and like hope that they can't gust. That's like a solid turn 2 Iron Hands response for Gardevoir. But then it just takes like one gust from a Rhydon and the game kind of falls apart, Yep. And so that's tough to see the heavy Miraidon representation plus the Dragapult representation, which is, again, not an auto loss, but it is one of the harder matchups. And I think that pretty cleanly explains why Gardevoir was very present at the tournament, but didn't thrive at the tippity top tables where Miraidon and Dragapult were like plaguing the scene. Um, I think going forward, Gardevoir is probably fine. It's just the field doesn't seem like super favored for Gardevoir to win without some like reinventing of the deck.
Well, and that's what I wanted to bring up because this list from Michael Davidson, seventh place finisher, was a pretty big departure. I mean, we've seen Gardevoir decks,
The Hero's Cape, and actually a lot of the Gardevoir players were on a Hero's Cape version.
They were.
I saw several different players.
Yeah, we can hypothesize that about that in just a second. But it does seem like Gardevoir just continually players are innovating with it and coming up with new strategies. There's the Gardevoir of multiple years ago, just kind of busting out onto the scene and being this huge thing. We have the Gardevoir from, last format playing heavily into the secret box. And now there's, Gardevoir in this format, new players, players are innovating in new ways with the Hero's Cape and some other unique ace specs. So really fascinating stuff. Let's talk a little bit about the ace spec of choice for Michael and a few of the other better placing Gardevoir players. The Hero's Cape. So, of course, Hero's Cape is the ace spec of this deck. This Pokemon this card is attached to gets plus 100 HP. What do you see as being the main use cases for Hero's Cape? And I will point out there is no Drifloon in this list. So it's not like you do have the Screamtail to get up to those boosted numbers, but it's not like you're attaching it, and everyone would say, oh, the main use case is so that your Drifloon can hit huge numbers. I mean, that's not happening here. So in this list, without Drifloon, where do you see Hero's Cape fitting in? Like, what is the reasoning?
Well, I think the Screamtail is kind of noteworthy in of itself. You do hit pretty noteworthily high numbers with the Screamtail. To be honest, and maybe you have a better answer than me, I think it's almost like a defensive measure rather than an traditionally offense. Sorry, my cat bumped my mic as well. He's like screaming at me too. What's the matter, buddy? It almost feels like a little bit of a defensive measure in addition to just like being able to power up the Screamtail, though. Like you can get a Badoo for 130, and throw that in a Miraidon's face, and they're not playing Zapdos, and so now all of a sudden you have a Badoo that is resilient. You can throw it on a Kirlia and like prevent it from getting knocked out, and that's compatible on like the Bravery Charm. You have the like an insanely big Gardevoir EX that you can throw out there. You can to me it feels like a defensive application of the tool, plus you have Screamtail as like a option, as opposed to like the more traditionally like Bravery Charm plus Hero's Cape, like maximize your tool type of strategy.
Yeah, I see it as like the big use case that I see it for, because you don't have Drifloon, and because Michael included three Monkey Dory and 3 Darkness Energy. The big use case that I see is, I mean, the main attacker, if it wasn't kind of already known for Gardevoir, is the Gardevoir itself, right? Having 310 HP and being able to Miracle Force for 190 plus any additional Monkey Dory damage that you get off is, a good attack. That's a good, just in a vacuum, a good strategy. And I think that the Hero's Cape, to me, I immediately see that as being the major reason that you would play it here. We've seen Hero's Cape in Charizard builds, and it was, same thing, kind of a defensive measure. Towards the end of the game, they'd slap a Hero's Cape down, Iono, and all of a sudden you're dealing with a 430 HP Charizard, which practically no deck can do. Similarly here, with Gardevoir, you put a Hero's Cape there, the rest of your board is going to be 1 prizers. Towards the end of the game, when your opponent needs those last 2 prizes, maybe they can get through a 310 HP or less Gardevoir, depending on how much damage you have on it from, leftover Psychic Embrace damage. Maybe they can get to that number, but it's going to be practically impossible for them to hit, those high 300, 410 numbers with the Hero's Cape. So that's kind of where I see it. And then, of course, you have the Hero's Cape Gardevoir with the Turo, playing 2 Turo. I think 2 Turo is fantastic. I've been running some games with Gardevoir recently. 2 Turo was actually what, I had played in my Worlds list when I played Gardevoir. I've always been a big fan of the 2 Turo. And, again, with the Hero's Cape, a lot of synergy there as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're totally on the same page about it being like a defensive, like elongate the game kind of measure. I think noteworthily as well, like there are some decks that could even struggle to two-hit KO a Gardevoir if you're like Monkey Dioring twice.
Or even
you have
3
a Hero
times.
Escape on it. Yeah, like probably twice.
Probably twice. Yeah, probably twice.
You could do 3. But if you're Monkey Dioring twice, for example, like you have to such high damage per turn to even 2-hit KO, which might not be viable. Like imagine even against like late game against a Dragapult, right? And they're maybe they burn through their Dusknoir line at that point, or maybe you knocked it out with like your own Monkey Dories or Gusting cards, and you have a 410 Gardevoir in the active that's getting healed for 60. What are you supposed to do as the Dragapult? Like gust around it and like place the damage somewhere else that'll still get healed off. So it makes a lot of sense in that way as just and vacuum counts are low, which further like supplements this. I think what we've really seen is that Unfair Stamp is just super out of the picture at this point. We had Secret Box last format as like the go. I'm going to put together a big combo in 1 turn card. And we're seeing people experiment with other ace specs, but not really the Unfair Stamp as much. Like notably Cal Connor, I believe, played the Hyper Aroma as sort of a supplement to TM Evolution. But I don't see any Unfair Stamps.
And it's
nowhere near the
it's
top.
kind of funny because I almost view Unfair Stamp as being just a super powerful card. I think a lot of decks are very they're very used to keeping big hands. I think about Dragapult, in especially. Of course there's Iono, but in those early stages Iono's not setting to 4.
I think it's
5,
true,
like,
but
I mean,
right in some
almost
ways.
Yeah, I just feel like yes, maybe there are better applications. Like Hero's Cape is certainly something I'm trying out, but I think like in terms of trends, like I think a card like Reset Stamp would be trending up right now for Gardevoir.
I personally feel like my problem with Unfair Stamp, and it's always been my problem with Unfair Stamp, like even when we first like read the card text on Poke Beach, is that it doesn't really do a lot for your game plan like by itself, besides just like hoping your opponent draws crappy off of it. And some of these other cards are just like so much. Hero's Cape isn't necessarily as proactive of a card, but in the absence of a lot of tool removal, you can pretty reliably count on it to like do what you're intending it to do. Whereas Unfair Stamp, like some of these decks have like Pheasantipede plus their draw Pokemon, and it's just like you will stick people sometimes. It'll be awesome. Plus you get to draw 5 for yourself, which is noteworthy. Or you could do something that just like more directly contributes to you winning the game, like having a 400 HP Gardevoir, like having 3 Curlias in your hand, like having the Secret Box to like completely pop off. Like Secret Box won't protect you from Unfair Stamp won't really protect you from the Miraidon unless you stunt them for a turn, but the Secret Box will, like Hero's Cape might, like, and that's, I don't know. I think it's just, that's my problem with Unfair Stamp fundamentally, is it's just doesn't contribute a lot to you like directly winning the game.
Yeah. Well, Gardevoir does have answers, I would say, to Miraidon. If we come out of Miraida with, and now that I'm saying it, Miraidon. I mean, we should have known. The scriptwriters couldn't have done it any better. But coming out of Miraida, where Miraidon was, the big bad, right? The deck that kind of, just dominated the tournament. Gardevoir is one of those decks that has answers. You think about Mimikyu potentially. Obviously, there's a lot of gusting options with Miraidon, but you think of Mimikyu potentially stealing a turn. I think of Mawile as well with the Tempting Trap. There's really, I don't see Miraidon players playing multiple of the switch cards. So, if they happen to bench something like Squawkabilly, if they happen to bench something like, um, a Luminion or something, right? The Mawile can just go ahead and take some, additional turns, potentially just winning the game almost outright with the tempting trap attack. So there are things Gardevoir can do. The space that it has, like, very few other decks can really match. Like, it just has a lot of these tools that it can use to kind of shore up some of the bad matchups. I even think of things like, TM Devo, if you're really worried about Charizard popping up. If you feel like Charizard's on the uptrend, okay, you can tech into TM Devo. We talked about Mawile, we talked about Mimikyu. Cresselia is a tech for the mirror. If you really want to go into those bigger decks, like, you could opt to play the Drifloon again. You have Spiritomb to slow down the stall decks. I mean, you just have a wealth, a treasure trove of options that very few other decks can match. I mean, we're not even talking about, like, some of the trainer options that you can play. Like, you could mess with the stadium counts, right? And play different stadiums depending on what you expect to see. So there's just a lot of things that Gardevoir can do, and I think it's the most resilient deck. I expect Gardevoir to be very heavily played and succeed at EUIC. I think there's just a number of ways that that you can adjust to the metagame. So I don't see Gardevoir slowing down. For me, it's a big three right now of Gardevoir, Dragapult, and Miraidon.
I think that's pretty reasonable take.
So, all right. Well, we talked about what we saw from Merida. Let's talk about just a little bit moving forward. Are there any decks that you see trending up? Like, to me, coming out of this tournament, yes, I'd be a little bit scared of Dragapult, but Charizard feels like the deck to me that would be on the uptrend. I mean, takes a, not going to say an auto win. I have beat a fair number of Charizards in my day, but a practical auto win into Miraidon. Has, decent enough matchup if you build it the right way into Gardevoir. That is certainly a deck that I see doing much better than it did in Merida. Are there any other decks that are on your radar for for Puerto Rico this weekend that you think may be trending up?
Well, I think our Caledon's looking kind of fraudulent after Merida, so not really looking at that. I am personally interested to see if someone can crack the Pidgeot control equation. So the first thing I would do before Puerto Rico is see if All Out Blitzel has played in any online tournaments recently and check out what he's been up to. And bar that, my personal deck of choice, I think, is still Gardevoir. I like it for a lot of the same reasons you mentioned. It's kind of a treasure trove of possibilities, and it's such a dynamic and fun deck to play.
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
Especially when you're not playing on the TCG Live and don't have to click one by one on the Psychic Energy and watch them do the little 20 damage counter every single time.
Yeah, yep. So true. I think Lugia is still there. Lugia feels to me, like a solid tier 2 deck if we talk about the big three as being tier 1. I mean, it's still in the conversation, don't get me wrong. It's still a solid deck, but it's really hard to come into a Miraidon format and see any success. So I think there's that. You had Andrew Hendrick coming in at 18th with Lost Zone Box. Really, kind of standardized there, using the Pikachu EX, Blood Moon as kind of the main attackers, Iron Hands, and there's that, I guess. I mean, I don't have too much to take on that, but there are still some other strategies out there. Raging Bolt in the top 32. You did have some Pidgeot control a little bit farther down, but that's just going to be a tough sell for me in this format. A Goldango coming in at 33rd. So there's a little bit out there, but you're seeing kind of a congealing of, again, Dragapult, Miraidon, Gardevoir, I would say, are these top two decks. Smattering of Lugia, Rolando, Gabriel, Coronado, Jimenez, top 4 with Cloth. Fascinating stuff. But by and large, a very tight opening weekend for the Prismatic Evolutions format. Now, one thing I do want to introduce before we go, I wanted to play a little game, Riley. I want to start doing this before some of these major tournaments. So we'll give it a trial run for today. We'll record our our answers, and then award some points for the next week after we get the results from Puerto Rico. This is going to be an over/under based on how many cards or how many lists or whatever we expect to see at Puerto Rico, and I've devised 3 different over/unders for the 2 of us to guess on. Sound good?
Sounds great. Yeah.
Okay. Over/under 2.5 Badoo in Puerto Rico top 8 this weekend.
2.5. I'm going to go under, I think.
You think you're going to go under? I mean, I would say don't look at the Merida Regional and say, and base your answer entirely off of that.
I know. I'm not saying Badoo is a piece of shit.
Okay, so Riley's going the under. I'm going to take the over. I'm going to take the over on that one. I could see, certainly Dragapult is a deck that, could play 1 to 2. You got Gardevoir potentially slotting that in as a one of.
You're counting multiple in one list as well?
Yeah. Total cards. Yeah, total copies of Badoo. It was under for this tournament, by the way, but that's the line. That's my sources in Vegas are giving me that line.
I see. I'll stick with it though.
Okay.
I'll commit to the bit.
All right. Riley's got the under. We have Miraidon, obviously the biggest story, but in Puerto Rico, will it sustain? Over under 1.5 Miraidon in Top Cut.
I'm going to go under for that too.
Ooh, I'll take the over as well. Easiest money of all time. And then this one's maybe the funniest prop bet that we have. Over under a single gouging fire in top 64.
Top 64 is crazy. So over under like half a gouging fire.
Yes, half a gouging fire in top 64.
All right. I like want to say over just because that'd be awesome. I don't know. I'm kind of doubting the Badoo one now. I feel like I should take it back. I think actually, could I do over Badoo, under Miraidon? I'm gonna go. I'll be a believer in gouging fire though.
Okay. So you're gonna take the over in the gouging fire. Wow. All right. Well, I think for
there'll be one. There'll be precisely one.
There you go.
And he'll be 62nd.
All right. For contrarian, for the sake of being a contrarian, I'll take the under. There we have it. All right. So I've recorded that. We will come back to that next week. See how we do. I don't know. I'm feeling pretty confident. Anyway, that is going to do it for today's episode. We thank you guys so much for listening. If you're over on an audio only platform, consider joining us over on YouTube, where we will be presenting all of the podcasts with a little bit of visual flair. If you want to get more involved in the podcast, you can go head on over to x.com, find the podcast at Tag Team Pokemon, myself at Real John Walter, and Riley at Smiles with Riles. Thank you all so much for listening. We'll catch you next week.
See ya.